Well, the way that tonight's talk came about was that Cat Vincent sprang into Treadwell's some years ago, and we never really let him go. He's a Fortean journalist, he's a writer, he's a lifelong student of the occult, he's a multimodality magician, his phrase, not mine, and he also writes for Darklore. His nexus of interests make him sort of uniquely positioned to talk about things that Treadwell's folk are interested in, hopefully you, certainly me: paganism, magic, the occult, belief, the way our minds work, the way consciousness works, the way we engage with stories, the way our imagination engages with what's possible, what's not possible. And we had the talk about 6 months ago, and he said something about science fiction, and I'm like, oh, well, yeah, but no, but yeah, but no. And the phrase that went through my mind, and then I nabbed him and we put pinned down tonight's date, was a phrase that many people here who are pagan may know, which is the phrase, may you never thirst, may you never hunger, which is a phrase that's permeated the American and British pagan communities as bread and wine are passed around after ceremonies. It's not universal in the UK, but it's very more widespread than one might think. And it traces back to science fiction. And as Kat and I were talking, and that little bulb went off in the back of my head, and I said, I'd love to know the story of that. And so many things, and Kat said, there's more and more things that, of the history of modern pagans and the history of modern science fiction, that is a whole stream of intersections that we don't know much about. Until tonight, dun, dun, dun. So, the way tonight's going to work is Kat will talk for a little less than an hour, till about 8:30. Then we will open up for questions. We treat our question time a bit like a seminar, except not a shit one, a really good one. So whether you come with an interest in science fiction, an interest in magic, whether you're a world expert on something, or just a lover and a beginner and curious, all of those interjections and questions are warmly sought. If you're shy, you have an hour to gear up and think of the things you're curious about. We love questions from shy people, so just saying. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Cat Vincent, Science Fiction and Paganism.
Thanks so much for coming tonight. Well, the first thing I'm going to have to tell you is I'm going to cheat about that title. As with any genre, exact definitions of science fiction vary from critic to critic and from fan to fan. And if I were to stick to a too strict a definition of science fiction, I'd have to leave out a lot of powerfully influential works. So there's going to be a few side roads into the realms of fantasy and horror fiction and comic books. I will, however, be sticking to the definition of the wider genre term popularised by the critic John Clute, the gloriously named, don't get it to work, Fantastica, literally meaning the literature of the fantastic, including all the types I just mentioned. Secondly, the genre works have influenced a great deal of modern occultism and mysticism behind the scenes, far beyond the realms of just paganism, and I'll be looking at some of those developments as well. And third, there is the reverse effect, that pagans and other occultists' influence on works of the fantastic has grown considerably in the past 50 years or so. That said, it's helpful to have some rough definition of what science fiction is, does, and what it's for. And so I'm going to steal from one of the best here. Neil Gaiman, in his recent introduction to the reissue of Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, provides a handy three-part way of looking at what science fiction is and does. He wrote, "There are three phrases that make possible the world of writing about the world of not yet. You can call it science fiction or speculative fiction, you can call it anything you wish. And they are simple phrases. What if gives us change, a departure from our lives? What if aliens landed tomorrow and gave us everything we wanted, but at a price? If only lets us explore the glories and dangers of tomorrow. If only dogs could talk. If only I were invisible. If this goes on, is the most predictive of the three, although it doesn't try to predict an actual future with all its messy confusion. Instead, if this goes on, fictions take an element of life today, something clear and obvious and normally something troubling, and asks what would happen if that thing, that one thing, became bigger, became more pervasive, changed the way we thought and behaved. A book which is often taken as the starting point of science fiction as a genre is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. Most people know the origin story of the book. Mary Shelley, her poet husband, Lord Byron and John Polidori gathered at the Villa di Dante in 1816, trying to outdo each other and creating horror stories on a dark and stormy night. The many variations of Shelley's tale which have followed often obscure the book's importance as a foundation stone of SF. In Game and Schema, it fits all three terms. What if the state-of-the-art science of electricity, then recently shown to be able to move the limbs of dead animals, could be harnessed to restore life to a human corpse? If only we could bring back the dead. If this goes on, what does this godlike ability do to us as creators and custodians of that which we have raised? And, as the great British science fiction writer Brian Aldiss was first to note, this is a tale where the protagonist, hello Victor, makes a deliberate decision and turns to modern experiments in the laboratory to achieve his aims. Other early SF works, then called scientific romances, such as those by Jules Verne, there he is, often involve this basic scheme of a creator going beyond the realms of then known science, but only slightly, such as the ballistic spacecraft launch system in From the Earth to the Moon, which is basically a supergun. The weaponised submarine of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Verne was far less concerned with the effects of these creators had on their world, however, than he was in writing a popular adventure story, a trait which never really left the genre as a whole. The same could not be said for H.G. Wells. All of Wells's science fiction books tend towards the didactic. The Island of Dr. Moreau and The Invisible Man are stern warnings about both hubris and the consequences of meddling with nature, while The Time Machine and The Shape of Things to Come are explicit warnings as to the possible future consequences of emphasising key aspects of society. And if this goes on story. It's interesting to note that of his work, the two which take on SF's most often assumed baseline story of space travel, The War of the Worlds and From the Earth to the Moon, are his least didactic. Sometimes less is more. And always, science fiction is never as much about the worlds of tomorrow as it is a method of using the fantastic to examine the world of today. Mention here should also be made of Edward Bulwer Lytton, the man who coined terms like the great unwashed, pursuit of the almighty dollar, the pen is mightier than the sword, dweller on the threshold, and it was a dark and stormy night. His 1871 novel, The Coming Race, was of enormous yet rarely spoken influence on the occult and spiritual currents that were to follow. In this book, he wrote of an anonymous explorer who discovers the earth is hollow and populated by adepts who were immensely wise and knowledgeable in manipulation of the life force, which Bulwer Lytton called viril. This book was a huge influence on the thought of Helena Blavatsky, Rudolf Steiner, and the proto-Nazi Volkist occultists of the Thurber Gesellschaft. Variations on the concept of viril appear in science fiction in many later forms, and it also gave its name to that ultimate expression of duality.
Oh.
You either love it or you hate it. Even this early on, the ideas of what would become science fiction were moving rapidly to the other media that were being born. Georges Méliès's 1902 film, A Trip to the Moon, was for its time, in the very birth throes of cinema, a state-of-the-art special effects extravaganza. 80 years later, Thomas Edison himself would film the first of many movie versions of Frankenstein, and 1916 saw the first adaptation of Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Audiences have certainly not lost their taste for such extravagant and flashy tales. Print, however, is science fiction's real home, and especially cheap print. One of the reasons I think that many literary critics scorn SF is its origin as a populist medium. Nothing exemplifies this so much as the American pulp magazines, especially Amazing Stories. Founded by Hugo Gernsback in 1926, Amazing Stories was the first publication to focus on science fiction, and it was Gernsback who gave the genre its name, although he first called it science-fiction. Not so catchy. This magazine and its competitors, such as Astounding Stories and Weird Tales, those of you who are here for my last talk will remember that was the home of H.P. Lovecraft and his group of writers who developed the stories later called the Cthulhu mythos. These brought imaginative tales to anybody with a couple of nickels who could buy them. A year after Amazing Stories saw the premiere of Fritz Lang's Metropolis, a savage social satire using what would later become common tropes of SF, a totalitarian dystopia, robots posing as humans, to comment on the political dangers of its time. And though the trappings were technological, many scenes, such as the birth of the Maria robot, carried more than a hint of occult ritual. You can just about make the inverted pentagram out there. Cinema, especially in serial form, found a rich scene to mine in science fiction, bringing weekly instalments of Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers, and the technologically enhanced detective Dick Tracy to eager audiences. Universal Pictures brought horror into the mix in 1931 with its adaptation of Frankenstein. Both it and Bride of Frankenstein 4 years later did not lack for occult tropes. As Dr. Praetorius toasted in Bride of Frankenstein, to a world of gods and monsters. The pulps and film, especially now the talkies had arrived, continued to capture the popular imagination. By the 1930s, science fiction had acquired many avid fans, some of whom started to organise meetings. Britain's first science fiction convention took place in Leeds in 1938 and included such luminaries of future British SF as Arthur C. Clarke. Another enthusiastic British fan was Olaf Stapledon, who wrote a series of highly influential works in the 1930s which had more than their share of the mystical. Books such as Last and First Men and Star Maker influenced many of his contemporaries, including C.S. Lewis, who was inspired to explore the combination of science fiction tropes and his own Christian apologia in Out of the Silent Planet and its sequels. The crossover between science fiction, fantastic fiction, and the weird and spiritual have dovetailed for a very long time. Many attendees of that first 1938 convention were also connected to Fortean groups. Even H.G. Wells had read Charles Fort, though he hated his work. The rise in interest in spirituality after the Great War had also influenced the fans, as did the arrival in that same year of 1938 of a new phenomenon, the superhero comic book. The first of which, let us not forget, portrays a working-class immigrant using his powers to aid the common folk, an idea that the vigorously socialist Wells and Stapledon would perhaps have admired. Needless to say, the Second World War changed everything. The multiple shocks to society worldwide, of course, had their echoes in popular culture, from the naked propaganda of Captain America punching out Hitler on the cover of issue 1, to newsreels and newspaper photos and footage of a total war startlingly similar to those shown in the 1936 movie version of Wells's Shape of Things to Come. Legends of Hitler's interest in both the occult and high weird technology, and all of these were punctuated brutally in 1945 by the nuclear destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which in turn would influence the next era of science fiction in both literature and cinema. Despite rationing and the war, or perhaps because of them, pulps were going very strongly and have been joined by the new publishing form of paperback books. Another important stage in the democratisation of the form, novels, especially later on SF and fantasy books, became available to nearly everyone. The aim was, according to their inventor, an early science fiction fan named Ian Ballantyne, was to make novels available for the price of a pack of cigarettes. Amazing Stories, meanwhile, had acquired a whole new level of high weirdness under the editorship of Raymond Palmer, who in early 1945 began publishing a series of tales by a fan named Richard Shaver, purporting to be true stories of an evil race of Lemurians who lived inside a Lytton-esque hollow earth, influenced human affairs via mind rays, and communicated with equally evil aliens. Fans were bitterly divided with the onset of these so-called Shaver mystery stories. Fandom had already developed something of a split between the sceptical, engineer, hard science fiction fans and those who are open to more spiritually and socially inquisitive stories. It must be said, however, that even the most sceptical and atheist fans had their little skirmishes with high weirdness. Of these, few were as influential as Robert A. Heinlein. Heinlein got his start in astounding science fiction, one of Amazing Stories' pulp rivals, in the 1930s, alongside Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov. They comprised the big three of what would later be called the Golden Age of SF. A former US Navy officer and naval engineer who'd been discharged due to ill health before the onset of the Second World War, Heinlein's work started out as exemplars of the hard science fiction form, in many cases helping to define SF concepts such as time travel and the militarization of space. As a result of his interests in both fandom and fringe politics, he did mix with some interesting people in the 1940s, including Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard. Parsons, a literal rocket scientist, member of the Manhattan Project, and convert to Crowley's Thelema in 1939, knew Heinlein from the Manana Literary Society, which met in Laurel Canyon, California in the 40s. It was primarily comprised of science fiction fans and writers, including Leigh Brackett, who would later co-write The Empire Strikes Back. Through the Manana Society, Parsons struck up a friendship with Hubbard, a prolific pulp writer at the time. As most of you know, that was not a meeting that ended well for those except Hubbard. The roots of both Dianetics and Scientology in his pulp fiction and his dalliance with Crowleyan occultism alongside Parsons are a clear example that the interplay between fiction and religion is not always a beneficial one. Heinlein, meanwhile, was considered one of the leading lights of the genre through the 50s in both the pulps and Ballantyne's paperbacks, a time when much of the genre, especially cinematically, was preoccupied with both the perils of the nuclear age and, since their first naming in 1947, flying saucers. It would take at least another lecture as long as this one to even start to examine the crossover of the UFO phenomenon in popular culture. Certainly, B-movies such as The Day the Earth Stood Still and Earth versus the Flying Saucers seem to have had sufficient influence over the UFO experience as to be paralleled in later sightings, or possibly vice versa. Never far from the occult and the paranormal, the phenomenon also led to the appearance of UFO-based mysticism, including such cults as the Aetherians and later the Raelian Society, and millennialist cults such as Heaven's Gate. The phenomenon was also of sufficient interest for Carl Gustav Jung to study extensively and to publish on the subject. Around this time, Ian Ballantyne's paperbacks would supply another vital ingredient to the mix: the 1960 paperback publication of Lord of the Rings. Between this and popular editions of the works of Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian books, technically part of the Cthulhu mythos, and pop writer Fritz Leiber's very influential Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser series, fantasy realms with strange gods and magics were also becoming part of pop culture. Paperbacks also allowed for more poetical works which transcended the boundary between SF and fantasy to gain an avid readership, such as Ray Bradbury's work, Fahrenheit 451, Something Wicked This Way Comes, and The Martian Chronicles. There was also the rising media force of television. Shows such as The Twilight Zone and The Outer Limits were bringing innovative science fiction ideas to an increasingly wide audience, with episodes often written by leading pulp writers such as Richard Matheson and Harlan Ellison. By the late 1950s and early 60s, SF and fantasy fandom and mysticism were mixing freely, providing a fertile environment where this mix of influences, and especially Heinlein's work, would influence a group whose belief and actions would make an indelible mark on paganism and other modern occult practices. It began as a group of young high school and college students in Fulton, Missouri, including Lance Christie and Tim Zell, who later changed his name to Oberon Zell Ravenheart. That's a man who plays his role to the hilt. They and their friends shared an interest in science fiction, the self-actualization philosophies of Abraham Maslow, and the writings of right-wing firebrand Ayn Rand, author of Atlas Shrugged. I'm going to take a moment here and quote the modern TV and comic writer John Rogers. There are two books that can change a bookish 14-year-old's life: The Lord of the Rings and Atlas Shrugged. One is a childish fantasy which often engenders a lifelong obsession with its unbelievable heroes, leading to an emotionally stunted, socially crippled adulthood unable to deal with the real world. The other, of course, involves orcs. Christie and Zell and their friends were galvanised in 1961 by the publication of Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land. Christie described the experience as being seized with an ecstatic sense of recognition. It was as if I had found in completed form the ideas which I was trying to gel into my own. Stranger tells the story of Valentine Michael Smith, a human child abandoned on Mars by accident and raised by the native Martians in their culture and beliefs. Key among these beliefs is a bonding ritual involving the sharing of water and the phrase, "May you never thirst," and the concept of grokking, to understand something so completely that you become a part of it. On his rescue and return to Earth, Smith is first bewildered by human society and then tries to integrate his Martian perspective with human beliefs and mores in a religion he called the Church of All Worlds, with far-reaching and, for Smith, tragic consequences. This combination of the outside perspective on human belief systems and Heinlein's espousal of many libertarian points of view caught the group's imagination. They, in turn, took the fictitious religion Heinlein had created and combined it with their own political and psychological interests and their burgeoning interest in pre-Christian belief systems, and formed their own version of the Church of All Worlds. When I first started doing the research for this talk, I was amazed and delighted to find a very familiar name cropping up among those influential on the early development of the Church of All Worlds. A gentleman named Kerry Thornley, among other things. Thornley, another member of the loose affiliation of rebellious libertarians in the late 1950s, was a former US Marine and an enthusiastic participant of the California drug and outsider cultures of the time. In 1958, in a bowling alley in Yorba Linda, California, the birthplace of Richard Nixon, incidentally, he and fellow pothead and contributor to the libertarian atheist magazine The Realist had a shared vision. At least he and Greg Hill said they had a shared vision of the true nature of theological reality, that it made no sense in a world as beset with madness and chaos as ours to worship a male deity of rules and order, that the more useful deity would be Eris, goddess of chaos and discord, and so the Discordian Society was born. As part of the Discordian mind-altering pranks as propaganda project known as Operation Mindfuck, Thornley was a prolific writer under many pseudonyms, some of which you saw earlier. Writing as one of his Discordian personas, young Omar, he contributed work to a newsletter for one of the Kerista communes of the time, in which he made the second of his notable contributions to modern mysticism. He coined the term paganism. In his piece, he wrote, Let us look at the jobs of the far less intellectual but far more constructively functional religions of old. These were the pagan religions, the religions which survive to this day in England and the United States as witchcraft, groups which both stabilised and overthrew the social structure, going on to describe paganism itself as an institutionalised cultural counter-trend. Concepts he cribbed heavily from Margaret Murray, Robert Graves and others. Although some British witchcraft groups of the time were referring to pre-Christian worship in Europe as pagan, the modern usage in the term paganism arose solely from Thornley and was popularised by the Church of All Worlds and associated groups. After 1963, Thornley's life got even odder. The assassination of John F. Kennedy hit him particularly hard, as he had served in the Marines with Lee Harvey Oswald and had been privy to discussions amongst right-wing extremists in New Orleans some years before regarding the feasibility of a presidential assassination. Further still, his girlfriend at the time, Lane Kaplinger, who was sister of future Twin Peaks-style Grace Zabriskie, was working as a secretary in New Orleans in the office of District Attorney Jim Garrison. And it was on Garrison's copying machine that the first ever editions of Principia Discordia were produced. Garrison later went on to accuse Thornley of being the so-called second Oswald in the JFK hit. Meanwhile, the Church of All Worlds was evolving. Absorbing many influences, including some from the Discordian side of things, the Church was defining a set of beliefs which required no dogma, accepting various mythologies as having spiritual worth, including fictional ones. The Church once described science fiction as the new mythology of our age. The Church itself had grown from its initial group or nest of 100 or so members to a dozen nests across America, all with deep connections to the science fiction fan world and its parallel Renaissance fair gatherings, which strove to create an authentic seeming simulation of an idealised historical life. These nests were also connected by the official church magazine Green Egg, whose influence on neo-paganism was considerable. One outside influence that was rapidly absorbed into the church's combination of myths was a startlingly original new TV show called Star Trek. It's hard to appreciate nowadays just how unusual Star Trek was in its time. It not only showed a relatively mature space-exploring human society with non-white and non-male authority figures, but also used a format which creator Gene Roddenberry had originally pitched to the networks as Wagon Train to the Stars, to tell a series of socially relevant metaphorical tales. It also introduced a philosophical concept that influenced both the Church of All Worlds and my young self considerably: IDIC. IDIC stands for infinite diversity in infinite combination. The concept, and this symbol, first appeared in October '68 in the episode Is There in Truth No Beauty? I guess I saw it a couple of years later in the first British reruns, and it had quite the impact. IDIC as a philosophy is easier to state, and like all such philosophical perspectives, far harder to practice than describe. This quote from the end of the episode sums it up. The glory of creation is in its infinite diversity, and the ways our differences combine to create meaning and beauty. This idea that there was everything to gain in the consideration and embrace of alternate meanings and perspectives, that difference is a treasure, not a threat, became integral to the Church of All Worlds, who had been formally chartered as a religion in the United States, the first earth-based faith to be so recognised, on the 4th of March 1968, a couple of months before this episode aired. There's a certain combination of irony and aptness in this, as IDIC was created by Gene Roddenberry and inserted in the episode for one reason: not to stimulate non-dualistic philosophies or symbolically question the unstable status quo of the 1960s, but to try and sell a range of licensed IDIC merchandise. The Church of All Worlds, the IDIC philosophy and Discordianism all good examples of a concept which, though not defined until the early 21st century, is worth noting here as it begins to become manifest, that of hyperreal religion. The term hyperreal draws on the work of the French postmodern theorist Jean Baudrillard. Adam Possamai, the Australian sociologist who coined the term, defines hyperreal religion as a simulacrum of a religion, created out of or in symbiosis with commodified popular culture, which provides inspiration at a metaphorical level and or is a source of beliefs for everyday life. Let's unpick that slightly unwieldy phrase. A key aspect of postmodernism, especially post-structuralism, of which Baudrillard was a key writer, is that in modern society, symbols have attained such importance that they have actually overtaken the things which they are symbols for. Baudrillard explores this in his 1981 essay, Simulacra and Simulation. Here, he draws a distinction between a simulation, a copy or symbol of something which actually exists, and a simulacra, copies of something which either no longer have a physical world equivalent or never existed in the first place. His view was that modern society is increasingly emphasising, or even completely replacing, the simulation with the simulacra, the actual being displaced by the never real. The term hyperreal derives from this perspective. The novelist and philosopher Umberto Eco paraphrased Baudrillard succinctly, saying that the hyperreal is the authentic fake. Although Baudrillard did not specifically talk about religion in this context, Possamai's use of the term fits broadly into the view that modern society is, if you forgive the pun, symbol-minded. The other key word here is commodified. It's a key aspect of postmodern thought that the main cultural aspect of modern society is its origin in a time period which has almost completely succumbed to neoliberal concepts around value and trade, an era usually referred to as late capitalism and dating from roughly the end of World War II. The late capitalist era is defined by the power of multinational corporations, globalised markets and labour, increased concentration of financial speculation, and most importantly here, mass consumption. In the late capitalist world, pretty much everything can be defined or co-opted as a commodity, as product. And that's the thing about pop culture. It's literally bought and sold. And it's this easily available aspect of it in combination with the Western world's emphasis on individuality and choice, thoroughly reinforced by neoliberal capitalist practices, which allow hyperreal religion to bloom. In a sense, hyperreal religion is a form of guerrilla warfare against capitalism, taking its products and using them in a way that they were not at all designed for to increase the freedom of its adherents. The one aspect of postmodern thought that has thoroughly leaked into the overall modern mindset is the undermining of the concept of the grand narrative, the belief in one true truth which underlines all aspects of a given society. While this has possibly led by rejection to the clash of civilization strife that dominates so much of the geopolitical landscape, it's also given scope for individuals to seek their own defining narratives and faiths. As Possamai puts it, in this consuming world, the individual becomes his or her own authority. The postmodern person in the West no longer tolerates being told what to believe and what to do. He or she is faced with the proliferation of spiritual, religious, philosophical knowledges which he or she researches and experiences. This personal seeking for truth has manifested in a variety of ways. For some, it allows them to find new and vivid metaphors for their existing beliefs, such as this glorious mural, which is in the Buddhist White Temple of Chiang Rai in Thailand. For others, it can give them the chance to move beyond the beliefs of their kin and tribe to find other beliefs, or, of course, to reject belief as a concept entirely. And most interestingly here, it can bring some people to find or even create a whole new range of faiths based on the stories they find within pop culture. If there's one thing we can say with certainty about the human mind, it is that it has a deep hunger for narrative. It is in stories that we have always found and transmitted our truths, probably from as far back as we've actually had language. It has been scientifically shown that our minds react nearly identically to a story as they do to that which the story is about. Whether or not the story happens to be, for want of a better word, true, doesn't actually matter. And from the 60s, and its rise in paperback books of both fiction and non-Western belief systems, a resurgence of the comic book industry and the rise of popular cinema and television, there were so very many stories to choose from. Science fiction at the end of the 60s and 70s was a very different place than at the start of the 50s. Key works exploring belief and social structures had risen to popularity, a major example being Frank Herbert's Dune, whose vast tale of a religious power struggle between a galactic empire and the decidedly Islamic-influenced desert dwellers of the eponymous planet Dune, the sole source of the mind-altering spice which allowed both interstellar travel and precognition, found a home on the shelves of many of those who were also reading Heinlein's Stranger and Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and the mystical books of the time. It also, quite by accident, gave modern occultism one of the most powerful mantras it has ever encountered. And I'll wager more than half of you have heard it. I've lost count of how many times I've used that. It works every damn time. The 60s had also seen the rise of newer voices in science fiction, talking about aspects that the heavy, hard science and engineering-oriented fans and writers had often neglected. Authors such as Ursula Le Guin and Samuel Delany were producing powerful works which examined gender and sexuality in a science fiction context. Le Guin also wrote the Earthsea fantasy series, which won the hearts of many people who would later find a connection to paganism. Philip K. Dick and William S. Burroughs were exploring SF themes in combination with the harsh perspectives informed by both counterculture drug cultures and mysticism. And the new wave in SF led the prolific author Michael Moorcock's British magazine New Worlds into bringing new perspectives and new fans, many of them with deep roots in the counterculture. Comic books in the 60s, especially at Marvel, under the watch of Stan Lee, Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, were pushing the boundaries of what the four-colour funny books could do. They introduced characters such as Spider-Man, the Fantastic Four and the X-Men, using them to tell metaphorical stories about the boundaries of science and the struggles of being considered different in a society that mostly prizes conformity. And, with books like Doctor Strange and The Mighty Thor, magic and pagan gods also found their place on the newsstands. Science fiction cinema was also changing. Inventive SF films such as Goddard's Alphaville, Planet of the Apes, and the Truffaut-helmed adaptation of Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 were a long way from the B-movies of the previous decade. 1968, of course, saw the release of 2001: Space Odyssey, where Stanley Kubrick took Arthur C. Clarke's original tale of a humanity manipulated since prehistoric times by advanced aliens and produced a solemn and beautiful masterpiece of the imagination. One which the counterculture took to its heart after it was cleverly marketed under the slogan, "The Ultimate Trip." It also produced one of the oddest filmed comic book adaptations of all time when Jack Kirby took the story and ran with it to the psychedelic realms familiar to readers of Doctor Strange and other Marvel books. It is perhaps a sign of the times that Kirby, a gruff ex-marine and hard drinker, was known to never use either cannabis or entheogens, but could still create comic pages like that. And of course, British homes have been invaded on a weekly basis since the day of the Kennedy assassination with the tales of that shape-shifting trickster god called the Doctor. Science fiction fandom was also developing by leaps and bounds. In both the US and the UK, fan conventions and small circulation amateur magazines known as fanzines were drawing in people from all walks of life, and the mix of counterculture interests which marched groups such as the Church of All Worlds made for a place where different kinds of people could mix freely. Star Trek fandom, for example. was elusive. A strongly inclusive bunch, embracing the Iddic philosophy. It was a place where people with many different outsider, spiritual, sexual and other interests could meet and share perspectives. It was Trek fandom which first produced the heavily sexualised romantic fan fiction which became known as slash fiction, where fans would set their imaginations to consider romantic encounters between the characters they enjoyed. The first of these was a series of vigorously described sexual scenes between Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock, which became known as K/S. As other pairings were explored, the slash between the initials became the term for the subgenre. The early 70s, although in many ways a retreat from the giddy optimism and cultural meshing of the 60s, continued a lot of the themes that SF and fantasy outpourings of the 60s had produced, though often with a bitter and cynical modern twist. British TV writers who'd cut their teeth on Doctor Who produced shows such as Doomwatch, an explicitly ecologically minded show which tackled themes of pollution and uncontrolled scientific experimentation, and the vicious post-plague apocalypse disaster and dystopia Survivors. 70s British telly in general, and especially children's programming, had some remarkable SF and fantasy ideas, ranging from the teenage wish fulfillment of the Tomorrow People and Sky, to pagan and occult-tinged works such as Ace of Wands, The Changes, and Children of the Stones. All of which drew a lot of viewers into their first encounters with pagan ideas. In 1975, the SF book world would receive the latest and most explicit manifestation of Kerry Thornley's association with the Heinlein influenced American libertarian and pagan movements. Back in '68, Thornley had met a young Playboy letters editor who was becoming increasingly involved with the counterculture scene and especially conspiracy theory. He was such an enormous Heinlein fan that he changed his middle name from George to one which was a single letter away from Heinlein's middle name of Anson, becoming known as Robert Anton Wilson. With fellow Playboy editor Robert Shea, Wilson set out to produce a massive satirical SF novel covering both modern America and especially its post-Kennedy obsession with conspiracy theory. Thornley's friendship brought Discordianism into the mix. The dogma-rejecting influence of the Church of All Worlds expressed there fascinated Wilson especially, and he set about not only writing the novel, but deliberately changing his own consciousness in regards to both belief and consensus reality, using a combination of techniques derived from his friendship with counterculture figures such as Bill Burroughs, Alan Watts and Timothy Leary. All of this became part of the story, which, after some delay in publication, was called Illuminatus. Its impact was strongly felt in the counterculture, especially among a group of experimental occultists working in London and Leeds. Wilson's autobiographical follow-up to Illuminatus 3 years later, Cosmic Trigger, Final Secret of the Illuminati, telling of his personal experiments in multi-model perspectives on belief in occultism, became a key influence on what would later be known as chaos magic. 1975 also saw the publication of a collection of short stories by Harlan Ellison called Deathbird Stories. Subtitled A Pantheon of Modern Gods, this collection was grouped around the idea that the old gods of the world were being replaced by new gods. Deities of electricity and city, the machinery of slot machines, and the horrors of drug abuse and social isolation. Although Ellison was, and remains, a staunch atheist, his poetic possibilities of the modern age evolving modern gods to fit it gave another place where the possibility of the hyperreal could grow. The science fiction cinema of the 70s produced a lot of strong works, often with paranoid or dystopian themes, such as Westworld, Soylent Green, and the ecologically minded Silent Running, directed by 2001 special effects expert Douglas Trumbull. But these were only modest box office successes. It wasn't until 1977 that SF and fantasy combined into a truly game-changing cinematic form, and one which led to a vast shift in the hyperreal belief statements. The runaway success of Star Wars, with its stunning special effects and revival of the spirit of the 1930s serials, an ironic side effect of George Lucas being unable to secure the rights for a Flash Gordon reboot, gave viewers not only a hell of a good time at the pictures, but provided a new spiritual metaphor, a Joseph Campbell-influenced syncretic mix of the 60s westernised versions of Eastern beliefs, and a revival of Bulwer Lytton's Vril, the Force. This was not accidental. In an interview between the release of Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back, Lucas said, "I see Star Wars as taking all the issues that religion represents and trying to distill them down into a more modern and accessible construct. I put the Force into the movie in order to try and awaken a certain kind of spirituality in young people, more of a belief in God than a belief in any particular religious system. I wanted to make it so that young people will begin to ask questions about the mystery. I didn't want to invent a religion." Perhaps to Lucas's chagrin. It would later turn out that he had. Star Wars led to a lot of imitators, most of which were not as successful, although one of these, the TV show Battlestar Galactica, would later be rebooted into a show which would examine the nature of the soul in artificial intelligences in a striking manner. Star Wars' success did, however, open the door for producers of other science fiction films, which could be made that went far beyond Star Wars' space opera form. The early 80s gave us two superb examples in the Philip K. Dick adaptation Blade Runner and Altered States, a science fiction exploration of the burgeoning interest in psychedelic mysticism. Both of these films explored complex questions of the soul in a visually striking and serious manner. Paganism was also developing greatly. 1979 saw the publication of two massively influential books, Starhawk's The Spiral Path and Margot Adler's Drawing Down the Moon, the latter including a detailed history of the Church of All Worlds, which was continuing to thrive. Both of these emphasised the rise of feminist influences on paganism, and were in turn influential on a book which was the introduction to pagan concepts for a whole generation, Marion Zimmer Bradley's The Mists of Avalon. Bradley, a practising Wiccan, brought her beliefs, especially the feminist aspects, to this retelling of the Arthurian mythos, and it also led to a resurgence of interest in fantasy fiction. Parallel with this rise of paganism was the appearance of chaos magic, which drew partly on the Discordian influences of Robert Anton Wilson and elements of Michael Moorcock's fantasy fiction. This decidedly postmodern approach to magic, with its rejection of dogma and even the very idea of belief itself as being anything more than a tool in the sorcerer's hands, would in turn find an enthusiastic audience and go on to influence much of later fantasy fiction. Although still robust and well accounted for in the media, science fiction literature by the 80s was starting to feel a little stale. Partly a result of TV and film plundering the genre's back catalogue for ideas, the standard tropes of space and time travel becoming over-familiar, partly following on from the punk rock rebellion against the old guard of rock music, but mostly inspired by the rise of a pervasive new combination of communications technologies called the internet. A group of young writers broke the mould with a movement called cyberpunk. The breakthrough works of cyberpunk, William Gibson's Neuromancer trilogy, and a few years later Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, were both concerned, as science fiction always is, with reflecting the concerns of their time. The rise of corporate power, ecological damage, and the role of the individual in an increasingly connected world were examined through a glass very darkly. And both took on elements of pagan and other non-Christian belief. Gibson's trilogy involved the rise of artificial intelligences who took on the persona of the voodoo Loa, and Snow Crash is, among other things, a retelling of the Babylonian Inanna myth, beloved of many feminist pagans. And in turn, these books were to directly influence the people who built the World Wide Web as we know it. Science fiction fans have always had a tendency towards neophilia, Robert Anton Wilson's term for those who enjoy and pursue novelty. And as a result, we tend to be very early adapters of new technology. A majority of the communications engineers who built the net were avid fans, and because of the overlapping interests we've seen, they have a tendency to be interested in an alternate political religious systems. Subsequently, those early bulletin boards skewed heavily towards the interest of fans and pagans alike. Cyberpunk and the rise of the internet was also a major influence on a new movement known as techno-paganism, taking elements from both neo-pagan and modern occult beliefs and combining them with the network-oriented models that are the basis of the internet and a healthy dose of Wilson's multi-model approach. Techno-paganism was a very modern and hyper-real angle on belief, magical practices, and how those can be integrated with technology just as readily as with the biological world. Although fantastic fiction has always had its fans, most people don't pursue that interest deeply. It's always been a minority interest, even in times when the genre has done well financially. Partly, this is because of the outsider status of the thing, the perennial war between jocks and nerds. But another factor was the difficulty of participation. Handmade fanzines and travelling to rare conventions required both time and money. With the rise of the internet and personal computing, the entry cost plummeted, and as a result, fans became able to more easily find their tribes. And these tribes began to become less geographically located and more international in scope. This allowed the West to discover the delights of Japanese anime and manga, for example, and major works such as Akira and Ghost in the Shell found enthusiastic audiences and in turn came to influence cyberpunk and later SF. Another fiction which inspired many people into their first discoveries of the possibilities of paganism was the British show Robin of Sherwood.
Yeah.
Created by Richard Carpenter, who had previously explored the crossover in SF and fantasy with the children's series Catweasel, the tale of an 11th century hedge witch transported to the 1970s. Carpenter's retelling of the Robin Hood myth was unafraid to embrace both the darker aspects of the history of its setting. For example, its Will Scarlet, played by young Ray Winston, was a traumatised sociopath. But it was especially innovative in its consideration of Robin Hood as a pagan figure. Key to this was Herne the Hunter. A combination of the Cernunnos myth with the legend of its namesake. Herne was shown to be a shaman, possessed by the horned god, and sent to guide Robin to serve the goblin folk of Albion. Despite vicious retaliation from the likes of Mary Whitehouse and other Christian fuddy-duddies, who are aghast at this heathen display on children's programming, the series ran for 3 seasons. Other popular British fantasy works, which are especially inspiring to many young proto-pagans and magicians, were the novels of Terry Pratchett and the late Diana Wynne Jones. Although Diana's work was less well known, she was a beloved influence amongst many fantasy writers, including Pratchett, whose popular Discworld books were once the most shoplifted books in Britain, and Neil Gaiman, with whom Pratchett would collaborate in their apocalyptic comedy novel Good Omens. All of their works led many readers to feeling their first stirrings of an interest in paganism and magic, and even hyper-real religious manifestations. Neil once told me a story of an attempt by a group of American pagans to replicate the spell to capture and bind the incarnation of death from issue 1 of Sandman. Yeah, it didn't go well. While Diana, Terry and Neil were not necessarily pagans or occultists themselves, they certainly had many friends and acquaintances in British fandom who were. And with the deep mythology of Pratchett's Discworld, with its 8 colours of magic and no-nonsense approach to both magic and the gods, was readily absorbed into Chaos Magic's toolbox. Gaiman was also heavily involved in a decidedly more adult shift in comic books, coming to fame as part of the DC Comics new British wave of the late 1980s and early 90s, which brought writers such as Alan Moore and Grant Morrison to a huge readership. Works such as Sandman, Hellblazer, Doom Patrol and From Hell. Sorry. Go away, Gothwind. Death appears and everything dies. Hello, con job. Hellblazer, Doom Patrol, From Hell. None of these works exactly shy away from the pagan and magical concepts expressed in far more graphic terms than the comic book medium had previously been able to show. These books were reaching a wider audience thanks to the publishing phenomenon of repackaging monthly issues of comics into omnibus editions called graphic novels, which were more easily sold in regular bookshops. The 90s provided particularly strong showings for science fiction and fantasy TV, which would be influential not only within the genre, but in television production generally. As internet fandom and the availability of first VHS and then DVD versions of shows gave fans a chance to not only discuss their favourite series, but to watch them again at any time, and thus examine them in more detail, allowed for fandoms to explore shows in a greater, deeper way. Many significant series were aired, ranging from the occult surrealism of Twin Peaks, the Star Trek revivals of The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, The X-Files, with its innovative serialization, deep internal mythology, and drawing on the UFO and Fortean fringes which have always interested fandom, and a new, heavily serialized space series with a complex spiritual perspective, one of the first of true novels for television, whose creator was an early internet adopter. The name of the place is Babylon 5. All of these series explored familiar SF themes of societal change due to technological or extraterrestrial influence, and the possibility of human transcendence into higher states of being. These in turn rising and influencing the technological secular beliefs of transhumanism and the singularity, the so-called rapture of the nerds. Although a majority of transhumanists tends to the atheist, they're also a group known as the Grinders, who are DIY transhumanists, and theorists who will not only borrow from techno-pagan concepts, but got their name from a comic book, Warren Ellis's Dr. Sleepless. Another show of the time which gained a great deal of love from pagan and magical subcultures was, of course, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. His lesbian witch, Willow Rosenberg, became an inspiration to many viewers who are questioning both their parents' belief systems and their sexuality. Another influential subgenre arising at the time is that of urban fantasy. Books which took magical elements and placed them in a modern environment, often with the elements of romance, gained a wide and enthusiastic readership, and many of the authors are committed pagans and magicians, ranging from one end with the monster-hunting post-Buffy warrior women, typified in Laurel K. Hamilton's Anita Blake series, to grittier, less sexy works, such as former Hellblazer scribe Mike Carey's Felix Castor books. Magic and its application in the modern world gained a whole new range of mythos to inspire the mystically minded. As the end of the 20th century loomed, many works were caught up in its apocalyptic implications. Grant Morrison, already a practicing magician, deliberately set in motion an act of postmodern magic by encoding both chaos techniques and elements of autobiography in his apocalyptic comic book series and hypersigil, The Invisibles, which in turn, alongside anime such as Akira, would strongly influence a film which was the most successful of 1999's many gnostically tinged movies, The Matrix, which includes a cameo appearance of Baudrillard's Simulation and Simulacra. 98 and 99 saw several films with an almost Phil Dickian theme of your reality isn't real. Although The Matrix was the most popular, there were many others, such as Pleasantville, Being John Malkovich, Existenz, The 13th Floor, and my own favourite, Dark City, which includes one of the best magical combat scenes in cinema. Mm-hmm. These films offered receptive viewers a strong hint that their consensus reality was not that much of a consensus and not all that real either. And, of course, there was Harry Potter. Rolling's runaway success set publishing and the associated media ablaze. Like Star Wars before it, it has spawned a lot of imitators and also opened the way for movies to invest heavily in fantasy works. Between the rise of what's become known as young adult fiction and the expensive adaptations such as Peter Jackson's version of Lord of the Rings, we're still feeling the effects of that one. The awaited apocalypse at the end of 1999 didn't come, of course, and 2001 was hardly a space odyssey. Instead, we got 9/11 and a resurgence of the clash of civilizations, us and them narratives between monotheistic extremists. But 2001 also saw a decidedly hyper-real religious development. In that year, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand and Canada undertook a national census, the first in which those were surveyed and asked their religion. In the UK and Australia in particular, there was an enthusiastic internet campaign to encourage people to claim Jedi Knight as their religion of choice. This was a remarkable success. 390,000 UK citizens and over 70,000 Australians were now officially Jedi Knights. These figures made Jedi Knight the fourth largest religion in the United Kingdom, far ahead of Judaism, all the non-Mosaic Eastern faiths, and considerably higher than the number of either pagan or Scientology adherents. Of course, many of those claiming Jedi as their faith were taking the piss, but some of them meant it, as many have since they first learned of the Force. And after receiving a substantial amount of publicity as a result, the wider public awareness of what was now becoming known as Jediism grew. And it wasn't alone. Online fandoms crossover with pagan beliefs exploded with the rise of social media. Pop culture magic was starting to be discussed openly, and many young fans found not only apt metaphors in their favourite shows, stories and comics, but developed belief systems based on them. Hyperreal paganism was growing in the realisation that for a great many people, to use the title of Christopher Nolan's excellent 2007 consideration of the comic books as modern mythology, our gods wear spandex. The immense popularity of comic book-based films, especially the Marvel Comics linked book series, has only expanded this tendency. We can now see Lee and Kirby's half-century-old inspirational characters on the big screen with state-of-the-art special effects and top actors in the roles. The new pagan fans of these incarnations of the gods, especially for some reason Tom Hiddleston's Loki, are enthusiastic and innovative. Others take inspiration from TV shows such as Supernatural, with its drastically reimagined mythological deities. Further still, some fans take their fictional or personal mythos so deeply to heart that they believe their souls are not human, but creatures of myth. These otherkin, as they are known, have developed a robust hyperreal belief set of their own, ironically one bitterly divided between those who hold that their soul is a generic entity, an elf, a wolf, whatever, and those who believe that they're a direct reincarnation of a fictional character, such as Neo from The Matrix or an anime character. Among the highly profitable TV shows and films, there have also been room for smaller movies that use modern special effects combined with deeply mythic storytelling to give us profoundly moving spiritual works. Of those in recent years, one which I found especially affecting was Aronofsky's 2006 film, The Fountain. It's an odd time for science fiction literature in the midst of all these successful movies. Fantastica is now a multi-billion-dollar industry, and fandom and Comic-Con, for example, as much a part of the media's business plan as any other branch of advertising. Never forget that 50 Shades of Grey, premiering just down the road at Leicester Square, started life as a Twilight slash fiction. And yet science fiction literature outside of the young adult dystopia styles is struggling. One reason for this is how very fast technological change is these days. We're living in what Warren Ellis has called the science fiction condition. Our world is now one where the technologies that would have been dreams of the future a decade or two ago are now the actual concerns of modern society. This makes writing science fiction, especially near future stories, increasingly difficult, as a writer's inventions can often be overtaken by reality between the writing and the publishing of the book. But the stories, the metaphors, remain. Some are being revised and rebooted, such as the spandex gods of the comics. Others find new forms of expression which still say something about our specific times. Post 9/11 surveillance society and strides in artificial intelligence research, for example, have led to the brilliant TV series Person of Interest, which combines these themes with an exciting action format to consider the role of humans in a world of warring AI gods. Not bad for primetime American telly. As I said at the beginning, science fiction and fantasy's gifts to paganism and magic have always been a matter of symbiosis. Paganism, as we know it, sprang from a combination of influences, both historical and fictional, and has in return influenced those fictions. A great deal of modern paganism has a tendency to look to the past. The trend towards reconstructionism of older belief systems has grown over the years, and its adherents have a somewhat hard-line attitude to systems that partake in part or whole of popular culture. There are also many pagan writers who passionately espouse the idea that the modern technological world is somehow not part of nature and must be rejected in part or whole. A romanticised, bucolic perspective, which, to me, seems more like a Renaissance fair than a true picture of our rural past. This is more than ironic. It's a rejection of the very origin of neo-paganism, born as it was and from fans taking the concepts from Heinlein's books, Star Trek, and other science fiction works. It also defies much of what makes us human, always the perennial subject of science fiction. Although we can't deny that many aspects of our late capitalist world are perilous and harmful, to retreat from them completely denies us our most powerful tools, and that's our species' use of tools, especially language, symbols, stories, that have been a core aspect of our development. And if anyone doubts that hyper-real religion is becoming increasingly accepted, here's a news item I saw literally yesterday. A Cardiff man recently died at a fairly young age of cancer, and his funeral involved a very special honour guard. Fun fact, one of those stormtroopers went to art college with my wife. If a fiction can play a role in our most important rituals of life and death, can it be truly said to be less than any other belief? I feel the new pop culture informed hyperreal beliefs have an important role to play, not only our approach to the gods and powers of this world, but in demonstrating that human imagination itself is the most basic, most powerful magic we have. They have a whole generation of smart, passionate, engaged young people who grew up with the internet, mass and social media and have found myths that closely matched their truths that, like for Lance Christie and Stranger in a Strange Land, bring them that ecstatic sense of recognition. The old gods simply do not speak to them as clearly as Harry Potter and Katniss Everdeen, Sam and Dean Winchester and Tiffany Aching. As one pop culture pagan recently put it, speaking to those old gods and their worshippers, you say they're only characters, you say they're not real. But where were you when I needed to grow? Where were you when I needed to believe? Where were you when I was dying? Who saved my life? Because it wasn't you. They're more than fiction. They were there for me, even if they weren't real. They were there when you weren't. They're more than you think they are. I can only hope that all believers in God's old, new, and both can find a way in these turbulent and uncertain times to learn from each other, to treasure each other's differences, to find infinite diversity in infinite combination. And that hopefully we may all live long.